Welcome to Urtic Live. I'm your host, Shelley Tingle with the Corporate Communications Office. And remember, today you are part of the conversation, so please be sending us your questions as it relates to our conversation today. Today is our very first LinkedIn Live event, and our guest is the Director of the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center, Dr. David Pittman. Dr. Pittman, thank you so much for being our first guest.
Thank you, Shelley. It's great to be here.
And for the people that don't know about Urtic, can you tell us a little bit about what Urtic does?
Well, thank you, Shelley. And first of all, we're in a COVID-like event here, so we have to space a little bit apart just to protect ourselves and protect Urtic. But the Urtic are the research laboratories for the Army Corps of Engineers. So we're over 2,000 people, 7 labs in 4 states. We're headquartered right here in Vicksburg, Mississippi. That's where we are today. But we look at a range of disciplines, from geotechnical and structure to information technology, coastal and hydraulics, environmental. In Illinois, we have our construction engineering research lab. In New Hampshire, we have our co-regions lab. And in Virginia, we have our geospatial research lab. So a wide range of disciplines in civil, military engineering, geospatial, environmental engineering. But our roots actually go back to 1775. The beginnings of this country. So George Washington was about to form his army. You know, we just declared independence and we're going to fight a war now. So 2 days into the job, he hires an engineer, Colonel Gridley. And so the Army Corps of Engineers, our parent organization, we're part of the Army Corps of Engineers, began in 1775 with a warfighting mission. And we have that today. So we're the Army's engineer. So we're actually some of the country's first engineers. So after we won the war, Revolutionary War, we actually had to build the country. So we built fortifications on our coastlines. We built our initial roads. The initial interstate highways were our rivers. So the engineers, the Corps of Engineers, were asked to clean our rivers up and make them navigable for commerce, and we still have that mission today. So fast forward to 1927. It's one of the greatest natural disasters in the history of the United States, the Great Flood of 27. So the Mississippi River was flooding from St. Louis all the way down the Gulf of Mexico. In Vicksburg, where we are today, the river was 80 miles wide, just to give you some context. So Congress said, look, that was a great disaster. Corps of Engineers, help solve that problem, because that's what we do. We help solve some of the nation's greatest engineering challenges. So in 1929, on the banks of the Mississippi River, right here in Vicksburg, they created the Waterways Experiment Station. And that's what we still call today here in Vicksburg. So we had the mission then for studying our nation's rivers, the hydraulics, the coastline, the coastal effects. So all through the 30s, then World War II hits. So that military engineering mission kicks in. And so we actually helped look at the waves and the landing times for D-Day, and all the landings that we had to do in Guam as we fought the war in the Pacific. So as you go into the 50s and the 60s, the Cold War kicks in, literally, and we're starting to worry about fighting in the Arctic. So we created the Co-Regions Research Lab. It started in the 60s. Then we started inheriting the DoD installation mission. That's what our lab in Champaign, Illinois does, Construction Engineering Research Lab. And so we look at energy resilience and building resilience and how do we have a sustainable installations with the environment. Then the 70s kicked in. That's when the term climate change was coined, actually, in the 1970s. And we started worrying about the environment with the NEPA Act and Clean Water Act, so we created an environmental lab right here in Mississippi, in Vicksburg. We have that to this day. And then the 80s, when information technology kicked in, you know, everybody's on computers. That's what we're doing today. And so we created one of the world's fastest supercomputing centers right here in Vicksburg in the Information Technology Lab. So that history kind of tells you we've been working on environmental things, climate change, and energy resilience really since our beginning. That's who we are. That's what we do.
So 3 of the biggest problems that we face today are some of the things that you just mentioned.
Yes. Of
climate change, environmental sustainability, and energy resilience. And like you said, Urtic has been addressing these for a long time.
Yes.
So climate change has had a growing effect on the U.S. economy, with weather and climate-related costs increasing up to 85% over the last 10 years.
Yep.
How is Urtic leveraging R&D to deliver actionable decision-relevant information to predict, forecast, model, and track climate stressors?
Well, you're right, Shelley. So climate change is like the issue of the day. It's not only President Biden's number one, national security issue. It's really a world security issue. It's really an existential threat to our security. And so as we talked about in our history, we've been kind of studying this for a long time. So in Urtic, we talk about this paradigm. It's called Understand, Predict, Shape, the operational environment. And so what we mean by that is we do a lot of research that help understand the environment. So sensors, We measure things. I just got back this week from our field research facility at Duck, North Carolina. It's been there since 1977. It's a research pier that extends a third of a mile out into the ocean, measuring just waves, currents, surges. It's the longest continuous record of just wave events in the world. So we understand the environment, floods, the environment, cold regions. Our cold regions lab, when it was stood up in the 60s, drilling cores down deep into the glaciers and the ice beds and in the Arctic and in Greenland, for instance, understanding the history of the world, really, and the climate over time. So that's understanding the environment, then predicting what's going to happen. Once we have that good understanding, that's where our models and simulations kick in. We got some of the world's best models and understand currents and waves and flows and floods and surges and impacts of the climate on, water and the environment itself. And looking at the environment and how species, threatened and endangered species are affected by it. We have whole research programs in that, and invasive species. And the third part of that is shape. So once we understand what's going to happen out there, predict where things are going and what's going to be in the future from a minute from now to decades from now, then what can we do to help mitigate that? That's called shape. So a great example of that, for instance, is our engineering with nature concept. So this is where we actually do a lot of engineering. So we're used to building things like seawalls, for instance, to help prevent surges from impacting our communities that are on the coast. Well, engineering with nature takes that a step further. This is the greatest engineer of all is Mother Nature. So we work with Mother Nature to say, hey, can we build in some wetlands, some ecosystems, in addition, maybe instead of actually the flood wall, and build that to help protect our coastlines from surges, for instance. So that's a brilliant concept because it does many, many things for you. Not only does it protect you from the impacts, shaping, mitigating the impacts of climate change, hurricanes, surges, that sort of thing, but it does other things related to climate change. It actually acts as a carbon sink. That's what plants do for you. They absorb carbon. It gives you the surge capacity. It actually adjusts with sea level rise, so it adjusts to the conditions as that happens over time. So it gives you many, many benefits, not just that climate change protection type thing. So that's just one example of the kind of things we're doing to address climate change.
And so you talked about the rise of sea level and hurricanes. And so we have an interesting project going on right now
Yes.
at Tyndall Air Force Base that uses some nature-based solutions, but also energy resilience. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, that's a perfect example, and it combines our mission as the Army's engineers, the work we do for the Department of Defense, and this Civil Works mission, we call it. That's our water resources management research, flood risk management, environmental mission, navigation mission on our waterways. So we developed this engineering with nature concept really in our Civil Works capacity, but when Tyndall Air Force Base was basically wiped off the map just a few years ago by a hurricane, they're trying to rebuild. The Air Force is rebuilding Tyndall to be a world-class installation of the future. So we talked to them, and they talked to us about implementing some of the new technologies coming out, not just to make their installation itself more energy resilient and environmentally sustainable, but also bringing in engineering with nature concepts along the coastline to make it more resilient against climate change, sea level rise, hurricanes. So we're working with them and actually introducing that concept at Tyndall Air Force Base to help protect it for decades and decades to come, and being environmentally sustainable at the same time.
So Urtic has been doing lots of research in energy resilience since the 1960s through our Construction Engineering Research Laboratory. Currently, how is Urtic's research supporting energy resilience?
Well, we're doing that in all kinds of ways, Shelley. Department of Defense, for one thing, is one of the biggest users of energy in the federal government, which is one of the biggest users of energy in the United States and maybe the world. So we've had that mission. That's why we created the Construction Engineering Research Lab in the 60s. As we absorbed this mission for the Army and the DoD, we had to come up with ways of making our installations more energy resilient. So looking at, for instance, building envelopes. One of the easiest ways to save energy is to be more efficient with energy. So with our building envelopes, if we're trying to cool a building and we want to keep the cool inside, or we're trying to heat a building, we want to keep the heat inside. A lot of it leaks outside of our windows and doors and our walls themselves. So coming up with new techniques and materials to help just conserve the energy that we have. We also have this mission called operational energy. So when we deployed troops overseas, I was over there in Afghanistan, actually run this program at one time. We actually try to reduce, because every bit of energy we had in Afghanistan was basically based on fossil fuels. So we were having to burn diesel and gasoline and jet fuel to do our mission in Afghanistan. And so we were trying to reduce the amount of energy that we had to use, the amount of fuel that we had to bring in, because they didn't have any organic capability there. And so we come up with alternative energy source like hybrid systems, solar power, and combined with other sources of energy to reduce our energy footprint there. Another example is microgrids. So microgrids is just a way of managing energy on an installation, for instance. So if you can manage energy more efficiently, if you don't have to have a generator for every tent, for instance, or every building, and operating independently of everything else, if you can connect those together and manage that in a way, you can significantly reduce the amount of energy it takes to get the same amount of impact and performance on the installation itself. So those are just a few of the examples of the things that we're doing in energy resilience. Another great example is something called mobile nuclear power plants. So we're looking for alternative forms of energy, alternatives to fossil fuels. Nuclear power has been around for a long time, of course, since at least the 60s and 70s. We're looking at a much safer, smaller version of that. For deployment, you could use this in a base camp, you could use this on a military installation if it gets safe enough, and that's what we're researching right now with Pacific National Laboratories, Department of Energy labs. You can actually have it for a household use potentially in the future, again, and get off the grid entirely potentially and save those fossil fuels. That's the kind of research that we're doing with partners in the federal government, with industry, and with academia for this nation.
It's wonderful research, and it's hard to discuss a topic like energy resilience without bringing up environmental sustainability. And
right.
So we know that you just said that we stood up the environmental laboratory in the 1970s. So can you describe some of Urtic's R&D related to environmental sustainability?
Well, absolutely. So the Clean Water Act, everybody has a mental picture of the river close to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on fire in Cleveland. We were not really being very good at the environment, up until the 1970s. And so we passed the Clean Water Act, and the Corps of Engineers, who has so many operations on the military side, where their installations, one of the biggest owners of land in the United States is owned by the DOD, with their military installations. And then our water resources mission with the civil works along the rivers and our coastlines. So we had a responsibility inside the Corps, we call them our environmental operating principles actually, to be good with the environment as we're achieving these other beneficial effects for the country. Navigation, flood risk reduction, and environmental sustainability. So we had to become experts at how our engineering and how our functions that we're doing for the country has minimal impact on the environment and actually helps the environment. For instance, when we build a project along, say, the Mississippi River or Ohio River, there's all kinds of threatened and endangered species out there. They could be fish, they could be birds, they could be plants that we've got to protect. At the same time, we got to be able to navigate. We got to protect from floods. And so understanding what the birds, what the frogs, what the fish are doing and how the environment impacts them, and then how our operations impact them, helps protect those species and helps us get our mission done at the same time. The inverse is true for invasive and nuisance species. These are things like kudzu here in Mississippi, or something called harmful algal blooms, which is a huge problem nationwide, really mostly in the eastern United States right now. So Lake Okeechobee in Florida, for instance, the Great Lakes, lakes in New York, and really all over the eastern U.S., it's basically green slime. It comes into the lakes and the water systems, makes it not very good to drink, it smells bad, it's got some toxicity aspects to it, and recreation's impacted, and so how do we mitigate that? Well, that's part of our expertise. It's part of our mission. So we came up with a system. One of the ways we addressed it was a machine, actually. It's called the Habitat System, working with industry to do this. It can actually take that green slime, that harmful algal bloom, out of the water, so it removes the algal bloom from the water, and then it turns the algae into fuel, a biofuel, not a fossil fuel. So you have a twofer on that one. You help protect the environment from getting the slime out of the water, and then you create fuel out at the same time. So that's just the kind of things that we do every day inside the Urtic.
Wow, what an incredible win-win.
Yes.
Right now, we're going to go to our Urtic live audience. And so if you've been submitting your questions, I'm going to read those to Dr. Pittman. And I'm just, for those of you who just joined us, if you missed the beginning, this is our first Urtic Live. I'm your host, Shelley Tingle, and I am here with Director Dr. David Pittman. He is the Director of the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. And so the first question is, you mentioned different solutions taking place at various Urtic laboratories. How often do these laboratories work together?
Well, we have to work together. I mean, the Urtic itself was only formed about 20 years ago, by the way. So all these laboratories in Vicksburg, in Illinois, and in New Hampshire, and in Virginia, they all had different origins and different beginnings in time. So about 20 years ago, the chief engineer said, hey, we're going to be much more effective if we work together across the laboratories. We were kind of doing it before then, but now we've really done it. So now we're one organization working together because we know and understand as engineers and scientists the world's biggest problems, like climate change issues, for instance. Those are multidisciplinary issues. They're not just engineering issues. They're not just science issues. They're not just civil engineering. They're not just environmental engineering. They're not just geospatial. All of these things have to come together. And so, yes, we do work together across our laboratories, and not just within Urtic. As I mentioned earlier, we work with partners in academia. We have over 60 or 70 educational partnership agreements in CRADAs just with universities. We have hundreds of CRADAs with industry out there. So we partner with industry in getting these things done. So it's partnered inside of the Urtic and with partners outside of the Urtic in government, industry, and academia to get these things done.
Wonderful. Sometimes people talk about the cost of research and development. What is the cost of doing nothing?
Yeah, exactly. That's the argument I like to make, right? So the United States has been known for its innovation and its ingenuity for almost since its beginnings, right? How do we defeat the largest force in the world back in 1776 and in the 1770s? And all the way to today, American universities, that's why people come worldwide to U.S. universities, because of our innovation and our R&D. But we have R&D going on around the world, and we partner a lot with international R&D, by the way, going on. But we can't advance, we can't tackle these huge problems that we have, particularly on the engineering and science part, without doing R&D. That's, how do we benefit going to the moon? That was the basis for a lot of the great accomplishments we have today, including, the internet and other things that we have. And so the same problems exist in civil and environmental engineering and in the Corps of Engineers. So right now, the Chief of Engineers, General Spellman, is putting a huge emphasis on R&D and our mission space inside the Corps, whether it's civil works, where it's warfighting functions, definitely addressing climate change, energy resilience, and environmental sustainability. We know we have to do more. The President of the United States, by the way, is really putting an emphasis on R&D because we know it's going to take new technology development and advancement to tackle these huge challenges we're facing today.
I agree. Can you talk about the work you're doing at the Urtic Permafrost Tunnel?
Yes, great. That's a great question. So we actually have a tunnel in Alaska. It's called the Permafrost Tunnel. Why? Because it goes deep into the permafrost. We actually built this a few decades ago because we were very interested in permafrost itself, okay? Because we have a lot of structures in Alaska that as the temperature changes, when it freezes and thaws just in normal times, you can have structures that if it's sitting on ice that melts, the structures can tilt, buildings can tilt, towers can tilt. And if you have any kind of military bases or just civil infrastructure, you don't want them moving with the ground. So you have to understand the ground itself, right? Well, you can also, in the permafrost tunnel that we have, look back in time, millions of years. You can actually go into our tunnel, by the way, and I invite any of you to go out to our permafrost tunnel. It's outside of Fairbanks, Alaska. You're literally going back millions of years in time. You can see tusk from the mammoths, mammoth tusk. You can see green grass, plants from millions of years ago, still green. It's in ice. It's been preserved in ice. So great, great research tool, great public understanding tool for what we're doing out there. And you can look and you can do research to see how was the environment back then, how did it impact things over time, and it gives us insights to how things are going to happen in the future.
That is so fascinating. And so, let's see, let me go to another question. You mentioned a lot of problems Urtic is solving. How do you share that problem-solving knowledge with the nation?
That's a great question. That's why we're doing this LinkedIn Live event. So what we're trying to do, so one of the things the Chief has asked us to do, and one of the emphases that we have actually inside of Urtic is communication, right? Promote understanding, we call it. And then the Chief of Engineers comes along and says, hey, Dave, we really need to tell the story of research and development and its impacts inside the Corps of Engineers and for the nation, for the military and for civil works side of things. And so we're doing that in all kinds of ways. We have a LinkedIn Live event now, Facebook Live, so social media. If you're not following us, by the way, follow us on, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. We're all on social media. We're constantly putting stories out there of impacts of the things that we do on the challenges we face in the nation today. That's just on social media. We do things on the internet. We put out publications. We have one of the world's best libraries right here, by the way, in Urtic, that we manage for the entire Corps of Engineers. Award-winning library, by the way. We're digitizing everything. And then we do what we call tech transition. So the Federal Laboratory Consortium measures how laboratories do across the federal government in transitioning technology to the private sector and to the public. Guess what? We just won some major awards with the Federal Laboratory Consortium in how we transition technology through the private sector and how it's used out there. So no matter if it's doing tech transfer mechanisms with our Office of Research and Technology Transition, working with the industry and academia to get things done, or through our own pushes with our own media outlets and things, we're constantly trying to share our story. We know we got to do better. We're constantly pushing it, but it's a huge emphasis for us in the Corps and in Urtic.
And as you know, I love telling the Urtic story.
Yes, you do, and you do it so well, Shelley.
And so we love doing that. So in terms of energy resilience, how is Urtic helping protect installations from cyber attacks that can knock out installations' power systems?
Oh, that's a huge challenge. So we know that our military installations are vulnerable to attacks. Some of their biggest vulnerabilities, frankly, not just our installations, are financial systems. Cybersecurity is a huge issue no matter what you're doing around the world. There's people out there that really want to, do you a lot of harm, whether it's changing election results, by the way, or taking out your power systems, or impacting anything that you do. So the intersection of cybersecurity, by the way, we have one of the best cybersecurity research branches right here in the Information Technology Lab. We actually run a Department of Defense Research Engineering network nationwide, very high-speed network, and we do all the cybersecurity for that. We actually do research supporting that here in the Information Technology Lab. So we have cybersecurity experts, and as I said, we're already the installation experts as well, right? In the actual physical plant itself. But we know that there's a lot of vulnerabilities there. So we're working with our Huntsville Engineering Center. It's part of the Army Corps of Engineers in Huntsville, Alabama, and other partners out there. It's a huge area of research for us going forward because we don't have it all figured out yet. And we just got to get it, and it's not just on our Department of Defense facilities. Just think about the cyber vulnerabilities of our dams, of our water resources infrastructure, of our locks. So, nefarious people could, figure out how to open up a lock gate, and it wasn't us doing that. And so we have cybersecurity issues across the board. We're looking for new ways, partnering with academia and industry to solve those kind of problems. We don't have it licked yet. Fortunately, we haven't faced a huge disaster, but the enemy is always out there trying to cause bad things to happen. And so it's a constant vigilance. More research is needed to come up with great solutions to solve that problem.
So I'm going to have to give a plug to our to the Power of Urtic podcast.
Yes.
And so we just talked about
exactly.
cybersecurity. And
that's exactly right.
And of course, we've also covered several other topics related to this. So if anyone out there, it is powerofurtic.org if you want to learn more about how Urtic is handling cybersecurity.
That was our third podcast, I
That's
believe.
right, our third podcast. Fernando has a question. What are the effects to build our transportation network more resilient and sustainable?
That's a great question. So the Corps of Engineers really worries about the nation's first highways, which are our rivers. And so we have ports associated with that. We have locks and dams to get up, particularly the upper Mississippi and, for instance, Ohio River. So that's part of our transportation network. And a lot of our infrastructure, frankly, around the nation, whether it's roads, bridges, locks, dams, they're just crumbling. ASC just came out with their report card just a few weeks ago, and we have a long way to go to get our infrastructure up, just functioning and operating, much less, from a national security perspective. Hurricane Katrina, one of the biggest storms to ever hit the coast of the United States, completely destroyed highways along the Mississippi and Louisiana Gulf Coast, destroyed the city of New Orleans largely. So we know that our infrastructure is vulnerable from climate change impacts and just aging over time. So we got to have, so as we look at new ways of rebuilding, and that's what the President's doing with his $2 trillion infrastructure bill, is not only just rebuilding, but rebuilding smarter. So can we come up with new materials, for instance, that not only restores that bridge, or that port or that lock and dam or that whatever highway, can we do it in a smart way so that, for instance, with carbon absorbing concrete, so we can actually have new concrete materials that have a lower carbon footprint to start with, actually manufacture the binder, and then when it gets in place, how can it take carbon out of the air to help us on both ends of the equation? So just ideas like that to make it not just better, but more sustainable over time.
And I know your expertise is actually in concrete.
That is. I like to talk about concrete.
That was a great question.
Yes.
Jason wants to know about how Urtic partners with other groups outside of Urtic, such as other universities or laboratories.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we have partnerships in industry, academia, other government agencies. I mean, we work with just about every federal government agency out there, Department of State, FEMA, EPA, I mean, you name it, we're probably working with them inside the federal government. Some state and local government activity, but mostly at the federal government level. Certainly universities, we have over 72, I believe it is now, educational partnership agreements with universities around the country, and that's growing all the time. So we work with universities in 4 different ways. We do research and development with them because, we got a lot of smart people in Urtic, but we don't know everything. So they actually help us do the R&D. So we actually get graduate students. We hire from their undergraduates and graduates. So if you're looking for a great job, one of the best places to work in the world, please come work at Urtic. So we're hiring, right? We're in hiring mode. So we get faculty members to come work with us in developmental assignments. That's another way. So it kind of gives them a chance to do things together. And we're constantly looking at ways to solve big problems that they might be addressing as well. So collaborate on those sorts of things. So we're constantly working with the universities and industry, by the way. That's probably the bigger relationship we have and growing through our tech transfer office that we mentioned earlier, and just relationships that we have in partnerships that sometimes exist for decades. So definitely working with universities, some of the biggest universities in the world. We have a huge push right now working with historically black colleges, universities, and minority institutions. They have some fantastic capability out there, so it helps not just the Urtic and the R&D side of things, but it actually helps society in many, many good ways, kills several birds with one stone, so to speak.
Navita, I may have pronounced your name wrong, I'm sorry, has the following question. How do we make our roads more resilient to climate change? Has Urtic undertaken such projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally roads are built about 3 different ways. Excuse me, 3 different ways. You got concrete roads, you got asphalt roads, and then you got just dirt roads, gravel roads. And so, for concrete roads particularly, again, concrete itself generally uses something called Portland cement. And Portland cement is a kind of a carbon-intensive material. It takes a lot of carbon to actually make the Portland cement, and then, to actually construct it. So we need to look at new materials like different kinds of Portland cement and other types of binders to actually in the construction of the road itself. And then we can actually build things like bridges and other roads that literally takes carbon out of the air. So again, it helps you on both ends, from the manufacturing of the material itself to taking carbon out of the air for decades, because the largest structures we actually build in the United States are roads, highways. They're big. So if you're going to try to absorb, besides just forest and plants themselves, that's actually the best way to do it. The material itself can actually help pull the carbon out of the air and helps us on both ends of the equation. Those are a couple of examples for how you can build transportation systems smarter. We can also, by the way, build actually smart infrastructure. So we actually using smarter materials. We built sensors inside of them. Then I can actually tell how's it deteriorating with time. So we can actually maintain it when it actually needs to be maintained, not just when we get money to do it. And if you do that, you can make them last a lot longer. Don't have to spend as much money. You don't have to, redo it all. And that's what we have to do. We have to extend the life of the infrastructure that we have. That's still good enough to extend, while when we have to rebuild, do it smarter with smarter materials.
Oa wants to know if Urtic is using unmanned aircraft systems to conduct research on streams and wetlands.
Yes, we are. Yes. So we're using UASs or drones, just like every other research institute is. The military is. We use it for both our military missions and our civil works missions. So I believe the question was, are we looking at for environmental reasons?
Yes, streams and wetlands.
Streams and wetlands, exactly. So UASs, of course, and we actually, by the way, are helping. We're not just leading for the Urtic, we're leading for the Corps and really inside the DoD and establishing actually how you use UASs, from a research standpoint, but just from an operational standpoint, we're actually helping to write the policy for the Department of Defense, for the Corps of Engineers, and how these things are deployed from a research and development standpoint and from an operational standpoint. So, of course, as I talked earlier about, our paradigm of understand, predict, shape. So one of the ways to understand the environment and collect data is through the use of UASs. Those are sensors essentially using, either visual data or some sort of hyperspectral data to measure things out there so we can get a great sense in ways we haven't gotten before of what's actually out there, not just once a year. We can do this once a day or how often we need it, and then feed that information back into our models and simulation to say, okay, here's what it is today, visualize it, and then here's where it's going over time, and here's where it's going to be. So it's a great tool to help us understand the environment as it is today.
I find it so fascinating how we use so much data to make better informed decisions.
Yes.
Jeffrey asked the following: how about that new Engineering with Nature Atlas?
Yes, exactly. Hey, we got two of them now.
That's right.
So Engineering with Nature, we already talked a lot about that because it's such a huge paradigm shift for how we look at our construction and environmental sustainability processes. And so a few years ago, by the way, Dr. Todd Bridges, one of the founders of this whole concept, been working on this for like 10 years now. So a couple years ago, they published Engineering with Nature 1, the first atlas. I don't know if they anticipated there was going to be another one, but it was so popular, and it wasn't just a Corps of Engineer thing. This was an international event. So this is basically an international movement to look at engineering with nature concepts, and published over 50 or 60 different engineering with nature applications in the United States and in other countries around the world. It was so popular. By the way, we have our own Engineering with Nature podcast now, by the way, which is going fantastic. Been in place, started last year, and it's already blowing the world up. So we just launched the Engineering with Nature 2 Atlas, just like earlier this week. Yeah, 2 days ago. So it's even more stories, more great stories about how this can be done. And that's getting after telling the story that the chief asked us to do. And what we try to do is talk and work with our academic partners, our international partners, our industry partners, to get these new solutions out there that are more environmentally sustainable, help with climate change, and help give these solutions that we need to, face this big threat that we're facing.
Do you have any other closing thoughts?
Well, it's been such a pleasure, Sally. First LinkedIn Live event.
That's right.
And I'm glad we're going to do this. It's going to be a series, right?
Yes.
We're going to have more of these to really help tell the story of what we're doing, so we can tell what we're doing, and we hope to hear from you, the folks out there, on the things that you're doing and how we can partner together with you to deliver these great solutions. What we say in Urtic is we discover, develop, and deliver new ways to make the world safer and better every day. So we don't do this alone. We need to work with you. So that's why we're telling our story out there. We love to work with you to implement these new solutions for the nation's toughest challenges. So thank you so much, Shelley. It's been great to do this with you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pittman, for being my first guest. I really appreciate that. And thank you to our LinkedIn Live audience. And if you have any further questions, you can always contact us at urticinfo@usace.army.mil, or of course you can send us a message on through LinkedIn Messenger. Thank you so much.